For a while now, something in your life has gone quiet. Not quiet in a way anyone else would notice. You still show up. You still answer the messages, keep the appointments, laugh at the right moments. But underneath all of that, there's a flatness where there used to be momentum. A sense that the engine is running but the car isn't moving. And you can't tell anymore whether you're resting or stuck, whether you're between things or simply being left behind while everyone else keeps advancing toward lives that seem to be actually going somewhere. Carl Jung spent his life sitting across from people in exactly this condition. They came to him convinced they were failing. Their careers had plateaued or collapsed. Their marriages had cooled into arrangements. The dreams they'd chased since their 20s had either come true and left them empty or slipped away entirely. And almost every one of them interpreted this quiet, stalled feeling the same way, as proof that they had missed their moment, that their best years were already behind them, that whatever life they were supposed to have had somehow passed them by while they weren't looking. Jung watched this pattern repeat so many times that he stopped seeing it as tragedy. He began to see it as timing. Because what he noticed, again and again, was that this specific kind of stillness, this hollow, going-nowhere feeling that people were so desperate to escape, tended to arrive at a very particular point, not at the end of someone's story, right before the truest part of it began. Today I'm going to show you what Jung understood about this quiet season that keeps finding people right before everything shifts, why the stalling happens, what your psyche is actually doing while your outer life seems frozen, the signs that you're not stuck but suspended, held in place on purpose, and why the very thing that feels like proof your story is over is almost always the opening line of the chapter you were built for. Let me start with something Jung noticed that most people get completely backwards. When your life goes still like this, the natural assumption is that you've lost your energy, that you're depleted, burned out, running on empty. You feel tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. Things that used to excite you register as gray. Motivation that once came easily now has to be manufactured, dragged out of yourself by force. So you conclude that something has drained away, that the fuel is gone. Jung looked at the same experience and drew the opposite conclusion. He didn't think the energy had disappeared. He thought it had gone somewhere. He described psychic energy, what he called libido, though he meant something much broader than the sexual meaning the word later took on, as a kind of life force that moves through a person the way water moves through a landscape. And he observed that at certain points in a life, this energy stops flowing outward toward goals and achievements and other people, and begins flowing inward instead, down, beneath the surface, towards something in you that can't be reached while your attention is pointed at the external world. To the person experiencing it, this inward turn feels exactly like loss. All the energy that used to light up your ambitions has been pulled offline, and nothing has come to replace it in the visible world. So you stand there in the gray, assuming you're empty, when in fact something underneath you is filling. The withdrawal you're feeling isn't your life force leaving, it's your life force relocating to a depth where the real work is about to happen. Think about what happens to certain creatures when they outgrow the thing that has been protecting them. A crab, a lobster, an animal that lives inside a hard shell, reaches a point where that shell, the very structure that kept it safe, has become the thing preventing it from growing any further. The shell doesn't stretch, it can't. So the creature has to do something that looks, from the outside, like madness. It has to abandon its armor. It withdraws into a crevice, into darkness, and it sheds the whole hardened structure of its old life, emerging soft and defenseless and terribly exposed, because that is the only way the larger body underneath can finally come into being. That is what Jung saw happening in his patients during the still season. The structure that had protected them, their identity, their roles, their carefully built sense of who they were, had become too small for what was trying to grow. And the psyche, in its wisdom, was beginning to loosen that structure, to withdraw the energy that had been holding it rigid, so that something larger could take its place. The flatness they felt was the shell going soft, the stillness was the retreat into the crevice, and the exhaustion was the enormous, invisible effort of a self outgrowing the only shape it had ever known. Here's the part that makes this so difficult to live through. When the shell softens, you don't immediately become the bigger version of yourself. There's a gap, a period of being soft, unformed, without armor, and without the new structure that will eventually replace it. And during that period, everything about you feels wrong. You're not the person you were, and you're not yet the person you're becoming. You're in between shapes. And in between shapes is the most vulnerable a living thing can be. Before we go further into that gap, I want to name something Jung saw underneath so many of these still seasons, because it explains why they carry such a specific weight. He noticed that a great number of people are not actually living their lives. They're living a rehearsal of their lives. Jung called it the provisional life, a way of existing in which the real thing is always assumed to be coming later, once the current arrangement is over. You take the job as a temporary measure, and you're still there 11 years on. You stay in the relationship for now, telling yourself you'll figure out the deeper questions eventually. You keep the version of yourself that other people find acceptable, promising yourself that one day, when conditions are right, you'll finally let the real one out. The provisional life is comfortable in the way a waiting room is comfortable. It's climate controlled. Nothing terrible happens there. But nothing essential happens there either, because on some level, you've agreed that this isn't the real thing yet. It's the thing before the thing. And you can spend an astonishing amount of time in that waiting room. Years, decades, a whole life if you're not careful, waiting for a train to your actual existence that you keep quietly deciding to catch tomorrow. What Jung understood is that the psyche has a limit to how long it will tolerate this arrangement. There's a part of you, he came to believe it was the deepest and most authoritative part, that is not interested in the waiting room. It has an agenda of its own, and that agenda is your wholeness. You're becoming the specific and complete person you were meant to be. And when you've spent too long in the provisional life, when you've deferred the real thing one time too many, this deeper part begins to intervene. It stops cooperating with the arrangement. It withdraws its energy from the false structure. It lets the shell go soft. That's what the stillness so often is. It's the deep self declining to keep funding a life you were only ever half living. The flatness you feel toward things that used to matter isn't depression in the ordinary sense. It's a kind of internal strike. The parts of you that have been going along with the provisional arrangement have put down their tools, and they will not pick them back up until you stop pretending the waiting room is the destination. If you're feeling that flatness right now, that sense that things which used to move you have gone strangely inert, I'd ask you to consider that it might not be a problem with your motivation. It might be an accurate signal. Your deeper self may be telling you, in the only language it has, that the life you've been maintaining is no longer the life you're meant to keep maintaining. And that message is going to feel like malfunction until you understand it as instruction. Jung had a name for the passage that opens up once this deeper self takes over. He borrowed it from the old myths of heroes who had to sail into darkness before they could return transformed. He called it the night sea journey. In the myths, the hero is swallowed by a whale, by the sea, by the dark of the underworld, and disappears from the ordinary world entirely. For a time, no one can reach him. He's inside the belly of something vast, in a darkness with no visible exit, and the story pauses there, in that swallowed silence, as if nothing is happening at all. But something is happening. Inside the darkness, the hero is being changed, not by anything he does. There's nothing to do in the belly of the whale but wait and endure, but by the darkness itself, which is dissolving the person he was so that a larger person can be assembled. And when he finally emerges, he is not the same. He carries something back with him that could only have been found down there, in the place he was so afraid to go. Jung was convinced that this ancient story survived in so many cultures because it describes something that actually happens to human beings. There are periods in a life where you are, in effect, swallowed, pulled down out of the bright, ordinary world into a dark interior season where nothing seems to be moving and no exit is visible. And from the outside, from the perspective of your family, your friends, the culture that surrounds you, this looks like a person who is stalled, withdrawn, lost their way. But from the inside of the psyche, it's a necessary descent. You have gone down into yourself to retrieve something that could never be reached from the surface. The reason this is so hard to bear is that the night sea journey gives you no timeline and no evidence. You can't see the transformation while it's occurring. You just feel swallowed. You feel the darkness and the stillness and the awful uncertainty of not knowing whether you're being remade or simply lost. And every instinct you have screams at you to climb back out, to get back to the bright surface where things at least made sense, even if they made you miserable. Let me make this concrete because I think you'll recognize it more than you expect. Picture someone who, by every external measure, had arrived. Let's say she'd built a career people admired, the kind you describe at parties and watch people's eyebrows lift. She had the home, the standing, the sense of a life assembled correctly. And somewhere in her early 40s, without any single catastrophe to point to, the whole thing went quiet. She'd wake at 5 in the morning before the alarm and lie there in the dark with a feeling she couldn't name. Not sadness exactly, more like the absence of anything at all. The work that had once absorbed her felt like a costume she was putting on each day. She'd sit in meetings and hear her own voice saying the right things and feel completely detached from the person speaking. She did what most capable people do. She tried to fix it from inside the structure. She took a sabbatical and came back to the same flatness. She reorganized her responsibilities, delegated the parts she'd grown to resent, and the resentment simply relocated to whatever remained. She started running, then meditating, then seeing someone who told her she was depleted and needed better boundaries. Each intervention gave her a few weeks of relief before the gray seeped back in. And the more nothing worked, the more frightened she became, because she was doing everything you're supposed to do, and the door out of the darkness kept not appearing. What she couldn't see, what almost no one can see while they're inside it, is that she wasn't supposed to find the door out. She'd been swallowed. The whole point of the season she was in was that the old life, the admired and correctly assembled life, had finished doing what it came to do. It had carried her as far as it could carry anyone, and her deeper self had pulled the plug on it, not to punish her, but because there was a version of her that couldn't be born as long as the old version kept succeeding. The stillness she was fighting so hard to escape was the belly of the whale, and every fix she tried was really an attempt to climb back out before the transformation had finished, to return to the surface still wearing the shell she'd already outgrown. If any of this is landing close to home, if you've been in your own version of that gray season, trying every fix and finding that none of them reach the actual thing, you might find something steadying in a resource we put together for exactly this passage. It's called True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's approach to these interior seasons, built not to yank you out of the darkness prematurely, but to help you understand what the darkness is doing while you're in it. Think of it as a way to stay oriented in the belly of the whale, to work with the descent instead of thrashing against it. The link is just below this video. Now let me take you into the part of this journey that almost nobody is prepared for. The soft, exposed period that comes after the old shell lets go. When the old structure of your life finally loosens its grip, there's a strange interval where you have neither the old protection nor the new one. The shell has softened, but the new shell hasn't formed. And in that interval, you are more exposed than you have been since childhood. Everything gets in. A comment that would once have rolled off you lands somewhere tender and stays there. A song you've heard 100 times suddenly opens something in your chest. You find yourself moved, unsettled, raw in a way that doesn't match your circumstances, as though the walls you spent your whole life building have gone thin and porous all at once. Jung understood this exposure as the necessary condition of the change, not a side effect of it. The armor had to soften for the growth to happen. But that same softening leaves you defenseless during the exact period when you feel least able to cope. It's a cruel design in a way. The moment your life demands the most from you internally is the moment you have the fewest defenses available. And people mistake this defenselessness for weakness, for falling apart, when in fact, it's the signature of a self in the middle of becoming larger. What makes the soft period so dangerous, not dangerous to your safety, but dangerous to your transformation, is the overwhelming temptation to grow a new shell too fast. Remember the creature in the crevice. If it panicked, If it couldn't bear the exposure and tried to force its shell to harden before its body had finished expanding, it would seal itself into a structure that was still too small. It would trap the very growth it went into the dark to achieve, and it would spend the rest of its life cramped inside armor it had rushed to build out of fear. Human beings do this constantly. The soft period is so uncomfortable, so frightening in its exposure, that people reach for the first available structure that promises to make the vulnerability stop. They leap into a new relationship before they've understood what the old one was teaching them. They grab a new identity off the shelf, a new belief system, a new label, a new persona assembled overnight, and clamp it around themselves like a fresh shell, and feel enormous relief as the exposure ends. And from the outside, it looks like recovery, like they've come through the hard time and rebuilt. But they've built the new shell too small, around a self that hadn't finished growing. And within a year or two, they feel the same cramp they felt before, because they sealed themselves back into a structure that couldn't contain what they were becoming. The people Jung watched actually transform were the ones who could tolerate the soft period, who could stay in the crevice, exposed and unformed, resisting the frantic urge to harden into whatever shape would make the discomfort go away. This tolerance is one of the most demanding things a human being can do. Everything in you wants resolution. Everything wants to know who you are again, to have a shape to present to the world, to end the intolerable condition of being between forms. And the discipline of transformation is the discipline of not answering that demand too soon. Let me describe what it actually looks like from the inside, so you can recognize whether you're in it. There's the flatness we've already named, the withdrawal of energy from things that used to move you. But alongside it, other signs tend to appear, and they arrive so quietly that most people never connect them into a pattern. You may notice that your inner life has grown strangely loud. Your dreams intensify, vivid, insistent, occasionally so strange that they stay with you all day. Old memories surface unbidden, some of them decades old, moments you hadn't thought about in years suddenly rising up with their full emotional charge intact. You feel things that don't seem to belong to your present circumstances at all. This is the inward-turned energy at work. Jung would say the unconscious, which had been kept quiet while your outer life ran the show, has begun to speak, because you've finally gone still enough to be reachable. The loudness of your interior isn't disturbance. It's the deeper self, finding you at last, now that the noise of the provisional life has died down. You may find yourself pulled towards solitude in a way that worries the people who love you. Invitations feel heavy. Company that used to fill you now empties you. You want to be alone, not out of despair, but out of some instinct you can't quite explain, as though being around others requires you to perform a self you're in the middle of dismantling, and the performance costs more than you have. Jung saw this pull towards solitude as deeply purposeful. The self can't reassemble itself in a crowd. The transformation needs privacy, the way certain healing needs stillness and dark. Your withdrawal is the crevice. It's where the molting happens, and you may notice that you're becoming a person you don't fully recognize. Preferences you held for years quietly reverse. People you admired start to look different to you. Ambitions that drove you for a decade lose their grip, and nothing has arrived to replace them, so you feel unmoored, directionless, unable to say anymore what you even want. This is the most disorienting sign of all, because it touches your sense of identity itself. But it's also the clearest evidence that the real change is underway. The old self is genuinely dissolving. And the reason nothing has arrived to replace it is that the new self isn't ready to be announced yet. It's still soft, still forming in the dark. If several of these are true for you at once, I want to say something as plainly as I can. You are not falling behind. You are not broken. You are in the interval, swallowed, softened, turned inward. And everything you're experiencing is consistent with a transformation, not a collapse. The trouble is that a transformation and a collapse feel almost identical from the inside while they're happening. The only difference is what you do next. This is the hinge of the whole thing, so let me sit with it. The still season presents you with a choice, and the choice is not usually dramatic. It rarely feels like a fork in the road with two clearly marked paths. It feels like a slow, ongoing series of small decisions about whether to tolerate the discomfort a little longer or to end it. And most people, understandably, choose to end it. They can't bear the not knowing. They reach back toward what's familiar, the relationship that was finished, the career that was suffocating, the identity that had already begun to fall away. And they reconstruct it, because at least the old misery had a recognizable shape. Jung watched this retreat happen over and over, and it was one of the few things that seemed to genuinely sadden him. He'd see a person standing right at the threshold of their real life, the old structure dissolved, the new self stirring underneath, and then the exposure would become too much, and they'd flee back to the shell. They'd reassemble the provisional life with renewed determination and call it maturity. And it would work, in a sense. They'd stabilize. The frightening softness would pass. But Jung believed these people carried a particular ache for the rest of their days, a quiet awareness, never quite spoken, that there had been a version of their life they came close to living and then turned away from at the last moment, a self they almost became. Here's what I want you to understand about why the retreat is so seductive, because naming it robs it of some of its power. The pull backward doesn't announce itself as fear. It disguises itself as reasonableness. It sounds like being responsible. It sounds like maturity, practicality, not throwing away what you've built on some vague feeling. The voice that tells you to rebuild the old shell speaks in the most sensible tone you have, and that's exactly what makes it so hard to see through. It's not tempting you with something obviously wrong. It's tempting you with a return to a life that looked, by every external measure, perfectly fine. But you already know that a life which looked fine is precisely what stopped working. That's how you ended up in the still season to begin with. The provisional life doesn't fail because it's a disaster. It fails because it's too small, and no amount of rebuilding a too small structure will make it large enough to hold you. The soft, exposed, terrifying interval you're being tempted to escape is the only passage to a structure that actually fits, which means the discomfort you're trying so hard to end is the price of admission to everything you actually want. I want to turn now to the deepest and strangest part of what Jung believed, because it's the thing that changes how the whole still season feels once you understand it. Most psychology of his era treated the mind as something pushed from behind, driven by the past, by childhood, by what had already happened to you. Jung didn't disagree with that, but he insisted it was only half the picture. He came to believe the psyche is also pulled from ahead, that there is, in each person, something like a blueprint of the whole self you're meant to become, and that this future wholeness exerts a pull on your life the way a destination exerts a pull on a journey. The psyche, in his view, has a direction, a purpose. It is trying to get somewhere, and that somewhere is the complete version of you. If that's true, then the still season looks entirely different. It stops being an accident that happened to you and becomes something more like a course correction, initiated by the deepest part of you, aimed at your own becoming. The flatness, the withdrawal, the swallowing darkness. These aren't malfunctions in the machine. They're the machine steering. Your deeper self, which knows where you're supposed to be going even when your conscious mind is completely lost, has taken the wheel, and it's guiding you off the road you were on, because that road, however smooth, was never going to reach the destination. This is why the symptoms of the still season so often resist every ordinary fix. You can't cure a course correction with better sleep and firmer boundaries, because there's nothing to cure. The flatness will persist as long as you keep trying to drive back toward the old destination, because your deeper self will keep withdrawing the energy you'd need to get there. It's not that you can't muster the motivation, it's that the most authoritative part of you has decided the old direction is finished, and it will not lend its power to a journey it has already ruled out. Jung believed the discomfort itself carried information, that the symptom, as he understood it, was also a kind of symbol, a message from the deep self, encoded in the only language the unconscious has, which is the language of feeling and image and disruption. The flatness is saying something. The pull toward solitude is saying something. The strange, insistent dreams are saying something. And the task of the still season isn't to silence these messages, but to learn to read them, because they are, quite literally, the deep self trying to tell you which way your real life lies. Most people spend the whole season trying to make the messages stop. The transformation belongs to the ones who get curious about what the messages mean. There's a mercy hidden in this that I don't want you to miss. If your psyche is pulling you toward your own wholeness, then it wouldn't have initiated this dismantling unless you were ready to survive it. The deep self doesn't tear down a structure it has no capacity to rebuild. It doesn't swallow you into a darkness it can't bring you back out of. The very fact that the still season has found you is evidence that something in you has judged you strong enough for the crossing. You may feel utterly unequipped. Everyone in the belly of the whale feels unequipped. But the part of you that arranged the descent has already assessed your capacity, and it decided yes. The demolition is proof of the strength, not a threat to it. So what actually waits on the other side? What does the new shell feel like once you've had the patience to let it form around a self that finished growing first? Jung's answer might surprise you, because it isn't primarily about circumstances. He didn't promise his patients better jobs or better marriages or a windfall of external good fortune, though those things often followed. What he described was an internal reorganization, so fundamental that it changed a person's entire relationship to being alive. He described people who, having come through the crossing, seemed to be living from a different center. Before, their sense of okayness had depended on external things, on achievement, on approval, on the reassurance that their life was going well by visible measures. Afterward, something in them was rooted below all of that. They'd been down into the darkness and found that they survived it, that there was something at the bottom of themselves that held even when every external support had been removed. And that discovery gave them a steadiness that circumstances couldn't shake, because they were no longer standing on circumstances. They were standing on something underneath. These people made decisions differently. Where they used to consult the outside, what would look right, what would be approved of, what fit the script, they now consulted something interior, a sense of alignment or misalignment that they'd learned to trust in the dark. They could tolerate uncertainty that would have panicked them before, because they'd already lived through the ultimate uncertainty of not knowing who they were and come out the other side. They could be alone without loneliness, having found in the crevice that the companionship they'd been chasing was partly available from within. And they engaged with their lives more fully precisely because they were no longer desperate, no longer clutching at outcomes to prove they were okay. There was a quality of realness to their lives that hadn't been there before. The old life had been assembled out of accommodation, out of what was expected, what was safe, what other people's approval seemed to require. The new life was built out of a genuine encounter with themselves, and you could feel the difference. Their relationships got more honest, because they'd stopped performing a self they thought would be acceptable and started offering the actual one. Their work, whatever it was, served something deeper than the ego's hunger for status, and they lived closer to the present than they ever had, because the crossing had taught them that the present is the only place real life ever actually occurs. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the best chapter, not a chapter of better circumstances, though those often came, but a chapter of finally being the person underneath, the one who'd been waiting inside the provisional life for permission to exist, the self that couldn't be born until the old shell went soft and the darkness did its work, and you had the patience to let the new form harden slowly around a self that had grown to its full size first. And now I want to return to where we started, because you can see it differently now. That quiet that settled over your life, that flatness where the momentum used to be, that sense of stalling, of being left behind, of watching your best years recede while nothing new arrives. You came into this thinking it might be the end of your story. I hope you can feel by now that it may be something closer to the opposite, the deep self declining to keep funding a life you'd outgrown, the shell going soft, the beginning of a descent that only feels like an ending because you're standing at the entrance to it and can't yet see where it leads. The stillness isn't the absence of your life. It's the space your life is clearing so that something real can finally occupy it. The energy hasn't drained away. It's gone down. into the depth where the actual work happens. And the discomfort you've been trying so hard to solve isn't a sign that you took a wrong turn. It's the specific, unmistakable sensation of a self outgrowing the only shape it ever knew. Jung would tell you that your only real task right now is to keep standing in it, to resist the reasonable-sounding voice urging you back toward the old shell, to tolerate the softness a little longer than feels bearable, and then a little longer than that, to stay curious about the messages instead of trying to shut them off, and to trust, even without evidence, because there's never evidence while you're inside it, that the deep self which pulled you into this darkness knows exactly where it's taking you, and would not have begun the crossing if you weren't strong enough to complete it. The people who reach the best chapter of their lives almost never see it coming, because it doesn't arrive announcing itself. It arrives disguised as a quiet season that feels like failure. It arrives as the exact stillness you've been living in. And the ones who cross into it are simply the ones who could bear the in-between long enough to let the new shape form, who understood that the flatness wasn't their life ending, but their life, at long last, clearing its throat to begin. You're closer than the darkness will let you believe. The stillness that found you is not a verdict on your past. It's the first quiet line of the chapter you were always meant to live, and the only way to read the rest of it is to stay, soft, exposed, patient, in the very place you've been trying so hard to leave. If you want a companion for that staying, our guide True Self-Discovery was made for precisely this passage. 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's understanding of these interior seasons, designed to help you listen to what your depths are trying to say instead of drowning it out, and to work with your own becoming rather than white-knuckling through it. You'll find it linked just below.